Hi, I'm Zazzles. Thank you for joining me. I'm really excited about today's video because it's one I've wanted to make for a really long time. And today we're going to be making some paper, some handmade paper in the garden. So I wanted to make this last year, but I had to wait until it was summer again so that I could do my setup outside. And it's a really good day today, so I'm excited to get started. You may have seen some of the paper that I've made in a previous video on my wedding crafts. I make paper to make them into books like this. So I made some for my wedding using the table runners from my wedding that are in my previous videos. So you'll have seen this one already. This is a photo album, and I also made a larger A4 scrapbook from my wedding. We're going to be making paper today in the size to make A4 landscape books. And this is the biggest size that I can make. It's my preferred size for a scrapbook. So we are making paper this size, so double A4 landscape. And we're going to be using scrapbooks for the paper today. I went to my local charity bookshop and asked which books they're sending to be pulped. My husband used to work at a charity bookshop, so he knew that there were lots of books that they don't keep when they have way too many copies, or if they're too tattered and they send off bags full every day to be pulped. So I went in and asked, and they said I could take as many books as I wanted if I made a donation to the charities. So that's what I did. It felt a bit like sacrilege, but I've already shredded 2 books ready for this batch. You don't have to use books at all. You can use any kind of paper. In the past, I've made batches with just household paperwork, letters, with old school notes. This is a whole box full of some of my previous, just scraps from previous batches, so you can see there's lots of different variation. If you use lots of different types of paper, it can come out really speckledy, where the different papers shred different amounts. You can try putting things in the paper, so I made some like punched out some stars and put them on top of the paper in this one. And then sometimes it just comes out super thick. So this is like really heavy, maybe 600 GSM card. And that depends how much pulp you put in the water before you pull out your paper. And finally, this one is really blue because I used a road atlas and all the roads were blue in this atlas. So the paper came out blue, and on one side you can see it's really speckled because the edges of all the pages were color-coded. So this one's got lots of like red chunks where the paper didn't blend as much as the other colors. So yeah, it can come out all different types. There's no good way and bad way. I've never done it just with books, so I'm really excited to see if that will make a smoother batch than I've done previously, but I like all of the textures. I tend to just try and group the same weights and the same colors into the same books. So you'll notice all of these books have the same number of pages, but this one's a lot thinner than these two, and that's just because the paper that I chose for that book happened to be thinner. It's quite hard to make it consistent when you're making the pages yourselves, depending on how much pulp you put in the water. So if you make lots, you can just group them together in different thicknesses. So before we get started, I'm going to show you the equipment that we're going to use. I've shown you the paper that we're going to use. You need a shredder to shred it first, or you could probably just rip it by hand if you wanted to into little strips, but you need quite a lot. I'm probably going to use that whole bucket full in this batch. This batch is going to make 11 sheets of double A4. And the reason we have that small batch is depending on how much room I've got to hang out that much paper, how many sheets of J-cloth I've got to cover the paper, and also when you press it at the end you have to stand on top of all the paper, so if you make it too many sheets at the same time then it can get really wobbly at that final stage. So we're making 11 sheets today. We need 2 of these massive tubs. These were the biggest ones I could find in B&Q. This is 50 litres, and that is because of the paper size that I've chosen, this double A4 width. I need a really big frame to fit that. This is called a mould and deckle. So this is the mould and this is the deckle. And you can probably buy these from craft shops or online, but I made this myself with my mother-in-law, and I made it huge because of the size of paper I want, but you could be much more sensible and make it much smaller if you just wanted an A4 size or even smaller than that. And this fabric that is in the mould is a nylon fabric. It's like a thin curtain netting. And I'm following the advice of a book. Where did I put the book? Let me go find the book. This book. So this is a book called Creative Handmade Paper by David Watson, and it's really good, simple instructions for setting up your own paper making equipment. It's quite an old book, I think it's from the 90s, but it's got really clear images to follow, instructions, and really clear details about what you need. So he says that the nylon fabric that you need if you're making your own mould should be 50 holes per inch, roughly. So this was one of like the sashes that you put on the back of a chair at a wedding, and it was the right number of holes per inch. So you don't have to be too accurate, but that kind of thing, it's not hard to get hold of. You don't have to be too accurate in your frame making. It doesn't matter if it's slightly wonky because you can put a margin on the sides. This is just my little like template, so I've just sellotaped 2 A4 sheets of paper together, and I made it, I think, roughly 1 centimetre all the way around allowance. So it doesn't matter if your edges are a little bit ragged, you can trim them off and it'll still be exactly that A4 width or the right length for you. So you could have more allowance if you're worried about it. You could make a much more sensible sort of half of this size frame if you just wanted to make A4 paper. And then you'd need a much smaller tub as well to make your pulp in and make your paper in. It's only so massive because I've decided that I love A4 landscape scrapbooks, so everything is bigger. The reason that we need 2 tubs is because we're going to make up the pulp in 1 tub, then we're going to use our mould to stick it in the water and pick up our pulp, and then we're going to turn it onto a stand in the second tub. So for that second tub, we need a solid board like this. And this is 12mm plywood. It can be kind of anything as long as it's rigid. And we're going to levitate this on bricks, or suspend it on bricks in the second tub so that there's a bit of clearance, because once we've turned our paper onto it, the water's going to run off the side. So if it was just sat on the bottom of the tub, the water might just sit at the level of the paper, and we don't want that. We want it suspended so the water drains off and the paper starts to dry. There's a little trick that you do when you're stacking your paper up. You make a little mound of newspaper. By giving it a slight curve, it helps you roll the paper off. We'll get to that part. So we do need newspaper. So we've got some newspaper here. We also need a blender to blend up our paper and water to make our pulp. So this is why your shredded paper doesn't need to be too fine, as long as it will go in the blender. We need a bucket of water to fill our tub. We're going to fill it half full first, and then we're going to keep needing to add water to the blender to make more pulp as we make pages. So definitely need a bucket and a jug to take the water out of the bucket. We need lots of cloths. You don't have to use J-cloths, you could use linen, cotton, whatever you want, but J-cloths are nice and cheap and easy to get hold of. And because my paper is so big, I need 2 sheets of J-cloth per page that I make. So I need 24 plus 2 extra for my batch today. So I've got 24 sheets of J-cloth here. And it doesn't need to be pristine. You do need to be careful because any wrinkles that are in your J-cloth could get pressed in to the paper. So just make sure it's not got too big of wrinkles. If it does, then you might want to iron it before you start. But I'm generally not too bothered about wrinkles. You also need some pegs to hang up your paper to dry. I use a washing line, but you could use a fold-out air dryer if you wanted to. Once you have hung out your paper to dry, you can leave it for, if it's outside, it generally dries pretty quick, especially on a hot day like today, it might not take very long at all. And if you take it off the washing line while it's still a little bit damp, you can iron it and it gets a really smooth surface. If you just let it dry completely outside, that's absolutely fine. It just might have more texture to the paper. And also if it's a windy day, it might end up with like waves in the paper, which you can generally flatten out, but if it's really thick paper, sometimes those waves stay as well. And because I'm using 2 J cloths per page, I'm going to use some sewing pins to pin the J cloths together once I hang them out. But if you're making smaller paper, you don't need to worry about that. I think that's all of our equipment. So I'm ready to get started. And the first thing that I'm going to do is to prepare my newspaper to make that little hump that we can roll the paper onto. So for this, you're basically going to take individual sheets of newspaper, and for each sheet you're going to do an extra fold. So first one is just in half. It's that simple. And then the next one, it's in a quarter. You don't need to be perfectly exact as long as it's roughly like that. Found a Garfield comic on this one, that's quite fun. And then we're going to do an 1/8. And these instructions are in that book as well, Creative Handmade Paper. So I think I bought a copy of that book for my auntie on eBay and it was like £3, so it's really cheap. So I highly recommend getting a copy of that book if you're interested. So this one is a 16th. And then I think I'm going to do one more. So 8, 16, 32. And then we're going to alternate which way up these stack on top of each other. So you've got your smallest one, and then so that one's landscape, this one's portrait behind it, and then your next size up is going to go landscape behind that one, and you're basically making a really shallow hump, as smooth as possible. So that one was landscape, so this one's portrait, and then our final one is going to go landscape behind that. So we've got all these different layers, and that one is going to be the top. So this half newspaper is going to go on top in the middle of our solid board, on top of the bricks, in the middle of our giant 50-litre tub. So that's step 1. Then I'm going to put a couple of sheets of J-cloth over the top of this and wet it so it's all wet, ready for our first sheet of paper to be rolled on top of it. I'm going to go do that and then I'll come talk to you about step 2. And I forgot to say, the other reason I love this size of frame, this double A4, is because you can keep cutting it down and you can make all those sizes of books I showed earlier. You can cut the pages in half and make A5 books, and you can cut them in half again to make A6 books. And you can even make A6 horizontal books. So just by having this one large frame and having all this larger equipment, I can make all of these varieties. Whereas if you made A4 sheets of paper, you could only make these two. You couldn't make the larger one as well. So I've now set up my base layer to roll the paper onto with that little hump and some wet cloth over the top. And next we're going to prepare our pulp. So in the other large container, I'm going to fill it around about halfway full of just plain water. And then we're going to start making some pulp in the blender. So this is about 1.5 litre jug. I'm probably going to make about 1 litre at a time. And I'm going to put 1 handful of our shredded paper into here with about, up to 1 litre of water. Then I'm going to blend it, and I'm going to make about 9 of these to put into our half-full container of water to make our initial pulp. So that's step 2. So not everything went to plan. My in-laws were getting rid of an old blender, and so I replaced the old one I've been using for paper making for the last 5 years, and I just set it up and it just did not want to work at all. But I don't have the old one that I used to make paper with, so I just had to find another blender, the one I had under my sink that I've never used, and make do with that. It's not ideal. The jug blenders with the thin bottoms are better for paper making, and this one has a low capacity, so I had to make half a litre at a time instead of a litre. It didn't seem to blend very well. So we have some larger strips of the books with still words visible and things like that. But we'll make a batch, we'll see what it'll look like. It'll still make paper, it just might look more like shredded paper rather than plain paper with just a texture, no words on it. So we'll see how it comes out, but there are some tips for you if you want to do this. Is the blender does matter. I don't use the same blender I use for food, so using secondhand blenders, you're going to have some variation in how good a quality you can get hold of for crafting. You might have also seen that it was leaking quite a lot. That's the reason for the towel. So I've got a waterproof sheet and a towel on top of my dining table to put the blender on, because blenders and water don't go well together, so it would have gone all over my table without the towel. But now we've got our pulp set up, we've got our board with the newspaper and the sheets laid out ready to roll onto, so we're ready to make paper at last. And the first sheet is always a bit of a test because we don't know, again, changing the blender, I don't know how much pulp I've actually got in there, so it could make a really thin sheet and I need to add lots more, or it could make a really thick sheet and then I need to just keep taking more sheets out before I add any more. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our mould and deckle, and you put this frame on top of, so this is flat, so the fabric's attached to one side. So you always use the side that's flush with the fabric, and you put your deckle on top of it. And then we're going to hold it together like this, and we're going to tilt it in at the back edge of the water with the pulp in, and then tilt it under the water and then slowly pull it up. And then we're going to let it drain. You can shake it a little bit if you want to, tilt it to make sure it's even, but generally try and hold it flat. And then once a lot of the water's drained out, you can rest it on the top of the tray, take the deckle off, and then we're going to very carefully roll it onto our mound. And you have to do this quite quick, otherwise it will just slowly start slipping down your mould. But you've got to confidently flip it onto the J-cloths and then tilt it so it lifts up. If it's sticking, then you can use a sponge or a wet cloth and dab it at the parts that are sticking and slowly roll off, and the paper should be left behind, or the pulp in the shape of the piece of paper should be left behind on the J-cloths on the board. And then we're going to lay some fresh J-cloths over the top of that, give it a little pat down so there's no bubbles, and then start the whole process again. Put the deckle back on the mould, tilt it under the water, and as I said, just judge how thick your paper is. If it's really thin when you roll it onto the J-cloth, if you can see the J-cloth through the paper, then add more pulp, make up some more in the blender, 1 or 2 at a time. If it's really thick and you can see it's got a good thickness to it, then just go straight again and take another sheet out, and you can keep doing that and judging if you need to add more pulp or not. So I'm going to do that and start making my paper. I'll see you on the other side. Okay, so that was a roller coaster. For a long time I thought that's the worst batch I've ever made because the blender was just not blending. There were still full shreds of paper in the pulp. So the first sheet that I took was basically the whole surface layer because the pulp usually sinks, but this was just all floating on the surface, all strips of paper. So we're gonna have some really interesting sheets. But then my mother-in-law rang me halfway through and told me how to get the other blender working. So the last 3 or 4 sheets are actually what I was hoping it would look like. So hopefully I'll be able to show you the good paper. The first stuff, it won't necessarily be bad, it'll just be a completely different texture. You'll see the words on the page and things like that. So it might be really interesting and we could use that kind of paper in like a book journal or something like that. So we may just discover a new technique rather than it being bad. But I'm glad I got it how I wanted it at the end, how I'd normally do it. And this is the first batch of the season, so that's always a bit weird, especially when you're using new equipment. So I'm hoping to do a few more batches with the same setup. You don't have to take everything down and put it back up again. You can leave the water with the pulp in, cover it overnight and use it again the next day. The water level might drop if it's hot and it evaporates, but you can just top it up, or equally if it gets too full you can just siphon off some off the top and get it back down to a level where you're not overflowing. While I was making the paper, you may have noticed every time I made a new sheet I was putting my hand through the pulp to mix it up again, because if the pulp all sinks to the bottom then you might not get any on your mould. So shake it all up so that you can get underneath. Also, once I'd rolled it onto the board, you may have noticed me prodding around quite a lot. You can be quite rough with it at that stage because we're going to press it so hard, it's quite forgiving. So if there's holes next to lots of pulp, I'll shift the pulp around to cover up the holes, or if there's bubbles, I'll pop the bubbles at that stage so that I can make sure there are no holes once the bubbles popped. And yeah, you can get a bit more hands-on. And also when you're rolling it, if you see that a bit stuck to the mould, you'll notice I was using my hand. I said earlier you could use a sponge, but you can also use your hand to like push it into the wet underneath, which then helps it come off the mould. So we've got our layers and layers of paper on the board, and the next step is we're going to use another board exactly the same, and we're going to put this on top of our last J-cloths that we used on top of the last piece of paper that we made. And then I'm going to flip the whole stack upside down, put it back on the bricks, and then we're going to carefully peel back and take out our newspaper mound, which was to help us roll the paper, because it's very hard if you're flipping something directly onto a flat surface. So that mound helped us roll the paper on. But we're about to squish all the paper together, so we don't want our squished paper to have a mound in the middle. So we're going to carefully peel it back, take the newspaper out, and then put the board back on. And then I'm going to put the whole sandwich with both boards on the floor in my garden, and then step on it very carefully, move my feet around to try and squeeze as much water out as possible. And then I'm going to lay it back on top of the bricks, and we can start peeling up our sheets and hanging them out to dry. So I'm looking forward to showing you that bit now. paper's now hanging out to dry. At the start I said I used the pins to pin the J-cloths together because I've used 2 separate J-cloths for each piece of paper, and that's true. But it also was starting to get a little bit gusty out there. Even though it looks really calm and warm and sunny, every now and again you just get a gust of wind that's just blowing these sheets of paper around, and that can literally just make the paper fall off the J-cloths onto the floor while it's still wet. So I've also pinned the sheets of paper next to each other so they're in one big-ish sheet, so they flap together, which makes them less likely to individually fall off in the wind. So while they're drying, in weather like this, it may only take an hour or so to dry, and we don't necessarily want them to completely dry because we can use the iron while they're slightly wet to take off some of that texture and make them smoother. So we'll see, we'll check on them in 45 minutes, maybe an hour. Some tips while I was peeling the sheets off: you have to be really careful the first part that you peel off. Make sure you're only getting the one layer of J-cloth, you're not getting multiple pieces of paper while you're peeling them up. And be really careful that first peel, make sure that the paper below is staying put. And if it's peeling up with you, you can just nudge it with your finger to make sure the paper below stays below and you're just taking off the J-cloth with the paper on top. And at the part, if you're using 2 J-cloths to make these big sheets like I am, where the 2 J-cloths overlap, make sure you're really careful because it can really easily tear if the J-cloth tries to stay stuck down while you're peeling the other J-cloth off. So yeah, just in general, just take it slow. If a bit catches, don't panic, just use your finger to ease it back down onto the layer below. And I'm going to tidy up, ready for the next batch. So I'm going to clean the blender, just give it a rinse. I'm going to pour the water out of the tray that just had the board and the bricks in. And then what you can do is you can turn that tray upside down on top of the one with the pulp in, just to keep bugs off, keep leaves off, but you can keep the pulp in the water ready for your next batch. So I like to do 1 batch per day and maybe do 7, 8, 9, 10 days in a row and then call it a day for the season or for that batch. And then you can either just get rid of the pulpy water, you can drain it through some more fabric to make a little lump of all the extra paper pulp and then pour the water away. That's probably easiest to stop blocking your drains. And then I'll check in again after we get our paper off and see what it looks like. So the paper's starting to dry on the line and it's all drying at different rates. So I've taken a couple of the sheets that were in the sun. They're still slightly damp. So this is one of the first sheets that we made. Underneath is one of the last sheets that we made. It is quite windy out there, so some of them have started to rip at the join between the J-cloths. So be really careful to pin those as securely as possible. Before they dry completely, we're going to iron them and see how smooth a texture we can get. I'm going to take off the J-cloths. And you can see because it was windy, this one's ripped. The bottom corner of it has fallen off. Depends how secure it is. You can iron the other side first and then take the J-cloths off and iron this side. I tend to like taking the J-cloths off as early as possible, otherwise you iron in the join between the 2 J-cloths. So I'm going to really carefully peel the J-cloth off so that it doesn't take any paper with it. And it's quite fragile down the edges especially. And you'll notice that the side that was against the cloth is smoother than the other side. So you might want to focus your ironing on the other side. So I'm going to do a little bit on this side. And then I'm going to turn it over straight away. And it's because this was the top of the water layer. So all of those floating bits that were more like the shredded paper than the pulp have floated to the top, so they'll be on this side of the paper, and actually the other side looks a lot smoother. You can use quite a high temperature on the iron and it does dry quite quickly. It's actually looking better than I expected. I was worried that the large shards of paper would be really obvious, but this page in particular, the words are quite small And particularly the back, there's hardly any of those strips at all. So that's why I never give up on a batch, because even if it looks rubbish when you first turn it out, or one of the sheets, it looked good in the frame and then I slipped while I flipped it over, and so it took a chunk off the edge, which was really annoying. But even those sheets with a bubble in the middle, you never know how the final version will look out, and the piece that looks the nicest on the cloth could just get ripped apart by the wind. So I never give up on a batch, because you never know what you're going to get in the end and what's going to turn out good and what's going to turn out bad. So that's our first sheet of paper. Oh, this was actually one of our last sheets of paper, so that's why the writing isn't as obvious. You can see there's some proper ground pulp in it. This one's threatening to rip at the joint, and just poke it with your finger if it's trying to peel up. But you can always use a bit of sellotape on it. It depends who you're making the book for. If you're making it for someone else, you might want to save the nicest pages for them. If I'm doing it for my own scrapbook, even ones with a little rip in, I'll just put some sellotape over it, or a little hole, then put some washi tape over it. If you're using it as a photo album, you might cover the little hole with a photo anyway. So yeah, this one's got a lot more of those big strands, but it actually looks really cool. So I'm really actually quite happy for a batch that looked like it was going really bad. So you can see this sheet here. Can you see all the words on it? And you might be able to see how thin it is at this end. You might be able to see some of the light come through it. So I'm not sure how stable that side will be. And this is the back side, which is a little bit smoother. And then the final stage is we're going to use our templates to cut it to the right size. As I said earlier, I've got just 2 pieces of A4 card that I've sellotaped together, and this is my base size for making the A4 sketchbooks. And so I can place it over my piece of paper, see if I can avoid holes and if the edges are really frayed. If I can't, then in this case I'm going to fold it back into the A4 sheet and try and find a part. So I'm going to line up my template, get a pencil, just draw around it. It doesn't really matter if you use pen or pencil, because you can cut that bit off. If you use a smaller frame, you could use a guillotine. So I've got my outline on here. And it's not 100% dry. I should have been more patient. You can see what I'd do at the end. I'm just cutting it out, and then you've got your finished piece of paper. And I can use a 5 size, a 6 size to try and get a few more usable scrapbook sheets from the other side. And you can do whatever you like with it. I would love to make another video about binding them into a book. So as I showed at the start, I make mine into photo album scrapbooks, and I absolutely love making my own books because you can choose exactly how many pages you want. Say you've got a certain number of photos from your holiday and you know exactly how many photos you need to fit into your book. You can just use the right number of pages for the number of photos you've got. For my wedding scrapbook, I knew what I wanted on each page before I started, so I knew exactly how many pages I wanted. And because the paper is generally quite thick, I just use packets of two sheets at a time. So these ones have like 10 sheets in, and they're still a proper book, 20 pages. So one batch, so today I made 12 sheets, that could make a whole one of these just from today's batch, if there's no ruined pages. But even if every page got cut in half because the wind blew the 2 J-cloths apart, I could make a whole A5 one instead. And even if some of those had holes in, I can make A6 ones. So yeah, I will hopefully make another video soon where I will show you how to make covers and do the binding on these kinds of albums using our handmade paper. And I hope you enjoyed that and it inspired you to try making some paper yourself. It could be quite intimidating, particularly with the equipment like the Mould and deckle. So if you can pick one up in a shop, then that's great. It's not that intimidating woodwork. As I said, you don't need to get the angles exact, you're going to have a margin anyway, and you can always make the margin bigger. You could have 2 centimeters on either side. All of the bits that we're going to cut off the edge of our paper we can put back into the blender for tomorrow's batch, so it's not just going straight in the bin, it's getting remade into the next batch of paper. So I highly recommend picking up a copy of the book that I mentioned, and I will write the written instructions in the description below, as I know I've kind of gone back and forth with tips and instructions and equipment and things, so it may not have been the easiest to follow, but I hope you've enjoyed the visuals of seeing how I go about making a batch of paper. And if you want to have a go yourself, check out the instructions below, or that book, Creative Handmade Paper. And good luck with your projects, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!